those who put their head in the sand are the most likely to be disrupted. I think there is going to be plenty of opportunity for those who understand generative AI, understand how to use it as a tool to augment their own ability, are going to be well positioned to continue to succeed.
Welcome to Sidecar Sync, your weekly dose of innovation. If you're looking for the latest news, insights, and developments in the association world, especially those driven by artificial intelligence, you're in the right place. We cut through the noise to bring you the most relevant updates with a keen focus on how AI and other emerging technologies are shaping the future. No fluff, just facts and informed discussions. I'm Amith Nagarajan, chairman of Blue Cypress, and I'm your host.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Sidecar Sync podcast. My name is Mallory and Amith, and I'm one of your hosts, along with Amith Nagarajan. And today, we're excited to be bringing you a special interview edition of the Sidecar Sync. We're talking to John Huisman, who's an associate partner at a leading global management consulting firm where he works with some of the largest organizations in the world. And you might be thinking, what do associations have in common with some of the biggest companies in the world? It might be more than you think. I'm going to share a little bit more with you about John's background after a word from our sponsor. If you're listening to this podcast right now, you're already thinking differently about AI than many of your peers. Don't you wish there was a way to showcase your commitment to innovation and learning? The Association AI Professional, or AAiP certification, is exactly that. The AAiP certification is awarded to those who have achieved outstanding theoretical and practical AI knowledge as it pertains to associations. Earning your AAiP certification proves that you're at the forefront of AI in your organization and in the greater association space, giving you a competitive edge in an increasingly AI-driven job market. Join the growing group of professionals who've earned their AAiP certification and secure your professional future by heading to learn.sidecar.ai. As I mentioned, John Huisman is an associate partner at a leading global management consulting firm, where he has spent the last 8 years advising clients across industries. He specializes in digital transformation, technology strategy, and operating model design with a focus on generative AI. Before consulting, John co-founded Redolo, a software consultancy that built custom business applications, emphasizing user experience for underserved business units in larger enterprises. He holds an MBA from the Fuqua School of Business and a BS in Business Administration from UNC Chapel Hill. If you feel lost in your generative AI journey as an association, I think this will be a great listen for you. We cover a lot of territory in the interview, but to me, one point stands out. We must shift our mindset from we need to implement generative AI because everyone else is doing it to we have specific business problems that generative AI could help solve. Enjoy this interview. John, thank you so much for joining us today on the Sidecar Sync podcast. We are so happy to have you. I'm hoping first off, you can share a little bit about yourself and your background with our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. And Amith and Mallory, thank you for having me. Yes, my name is John Huisman. I am a management consultant. And so a lot of my time for the last, called 7.5, 8 years or so, has focused on working with large companies, think Fortune 50, Fortune 100, or portfolio companies of large private equity firms, of solving whatever their most pressing challenges are. This has been led me over a variety of different industries and capabilities. However, the last several years, most of my time has fit in the consumer goods space, and likely most pertinent to your audience on technology. And so this is everything from technology strategy or digital strategy, operating model, to what I think is probably more exciting to talk about in like AI and specifically generative AI over the last few years. So that's where I spend most of my time today. Prior to that, in a previous life, I helped start up a software company that built custom business applications. So while I'm not a native engineer, I know a good decent amount about how products are created and how software is developed.
Awesome. And you were just sharing with me before we started recording how you and Amith know each other. If you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so that aforementioned startup was with Amith and I working together. So that was back in New Orleans, gosh, probably about a decade or so ago now, which makes me feel old. But yeah, we got to work together for several years, which was a great experience.
And were you all talking about artificial intelligence 10 years ago or not quite?
I think Amith was questioning my actual intelligence more a decade ago, but no. But actually, it's funny because I what we were doing a lot of is that was early in the days of cloud hosting. And so I remember that when we talk about new technologies and adoption, a lot of what we had to talk about our clients then was, hey, are you comfortable hosting this thing called AWS or the cloud? And what is that? And I'm much more comfortable on-prem. And so it's a different technology, but a similar paradigm of, hey, this is a new technology that is disrupting how things have been done in the past. And how do you help people get comfortable with it and learn how they can use it in whatever else they're doing to make their lives better or more productive, and hopefully help the bottom line as well.
Do you feel like your perspective on technology implementation has changed from your startup days to now working with large organizations?
Yeah, well, it's far easier with startups in many ways, right? You just have an idea and you go do it. A lot of my time today is spent less so on the answer of the technology itself, but the cultural and political issues that exist within large companies, right? And so whenever there's something that's disruptive, that scares people. And so helping them get comfortable with how this can empower them, how this can enable them to do things they haven't done before, and a lot more time with legal departments than I used to, who are very worried about how this technology will work. And so I think that's a burden that large companies deal with that smaller companies don't have to, which in many ways, while there might be more resources at a large company, those constraints can actually slow them down and allow small organizations to really move a lot faster and experiment and trial things and see what works and what doesn't, which can often be a pretty big advantage.
Yep. Amith, I would say you agree with that, right?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. It's fond memories and recollections of what John's describing with the startup here in New Orleans that we were involved in together, and that ultimately that company had a nice ending and it was sold, and it was a great experience along the way. And it actually was an incubator that spun off a whole bunch of other software companies, which was really, really cool as well. And, one observation I'd share with our audience just to kick things off from my viewpoint is I've known John for a long time, as you just learned. And John and I recently actually reconnected. We hadn't chatted in a few years until probably 3 months ago or something like that. And we had this great conversation all about AI adoption and John's practice experience. He's quite modest in this interview. He's doing some very high level work for some of the biggest companies in the world, working within one of the leading global management consultancies, and has some very impressive things. And I thought to myself, it'd be really great to get John to share some of his experiences, both the exciting parts and also some of the challenges. And what he opened with there in terms of the difference between his current life and what he did in startup land is actually kind of similar to what associations deal with, even though they're much smaller than the kinds of organizations, John, you're dealing with now. They deal with a lot of red tape, a lot of bureaucracy, a lot of layers of volunteer leadership, governance, boards, bylaws sometimes. So we'll get into that, I'm sure, in this pod. But like working through the human factors and the change management, I think it always has been the biggest challenge and opportunity with technology disruption, and it still remains to be the case, in my opinion.
Well, I want to jump right into the juicy stuff. So obviously we're here to talk about AI and the clients that you've worked with. When do you feel like you started seeing AI make a real impact in companies that you're working with?
Yeah, so I think it's important to separate AI and generative AI. And so AI has been a big part of clients for decades, and certainly as long as I've been a consultant, and you see it a lot in terms of forecasting algorithms, pattern recognition, sort of optical recognition, like that's been around for a while, sort of the AI and the machine learning realm. The generative AI, sort of the new sexy stuff, really over the last few years is where, I think it was probably November of 22, something like that, when OpenAI first launched ChatGPT-3, which is where I think most people started becoming aware of this. And obviously, it's funny, we sort of complain about the limitations, but it's kind of crazy. This sort of came from nothing to where it is, only in a matter of a few years. It's been pretty rapid development. But where I'm seeing companies use it is really trying to use it everywhere they can. And so for my clients, there are really three primary ways they sort of bucket use cases or applications. There are things, and again, this is for the consumer product space, but I think it's probably relevant to most industries. There are, how do I better engage with my end consumer and have a more personalized relationship with them in a way that the consumer finds valuable? I am not just forcing it on them, but they actually have to find value from this. There is, how do I work with my distributors or retailers, or this middle layer that connects my products to the end consumer, make them more effective increase their satisfaction? And then third, how do I just help my own employees be more productive, be happier, improve retention, things that is really relevant to any organization? Those are really the three main channels that we look at. And in many cases, the way we encourage our clients to think about this is there can be a trap when a new technology comes, especially one like generative AI, of like, well, let's just start building stuff and see what happens, which is kind of cool and fun, but it's not really a strategy for driving meaningful results. And so I sort of we're exiting now what I call the gimmick phase of Gen AI. If people create like kind of a cool chatbot and it was kind of fun and it was a sexy demo, but you can't really see it on the P&L. You can't really see, did it actually drive a meaningful impact? And thinking more in terms like, okay, well, how do we use this tech to actually change how we do the business and change how we run things? And one way I sort of help my clients think through this is not just focusing on what's today, but have these sort of big, bold, ambitious bets that might be 4 or 5 years down the road, but where are you trying to go with this? And so in the consumer space, that might mean, hey, rather than having 1 or 2 or 3 campaigns going in any given time, what if we have 8 billion? And we have a personalized, completely unique campaign that's bespoke for every individual. That's not something that we can easily do today, largely just because of data issues, but that could be something we want to go. And if you have that sort of ambition, then you can think through like, what are the stepping stones over the next several years to help get us there? What capabilities do we need? What talent do we need? And so that is an area where I think as many companies are starting to think, hey, we're spending a lot of money on this, what do I have to show for it? It's starting to be a little bit more structured and thoughtful about where are we trying to go to actually see those results, whether it be financial or however else you're measuring, rather than sort of where it has been up to this point, at least in my experience of, let's build something and figure out the business case later.
It's really interesting because I think those 3 categories are directly relevant to associations in the nonprofit sector. I mean, the one that you described, obviously the end customer, the end consumer, it's the same thing. It's the member, it's the constituent. But in the other 2, and obviously they have staff, they have employees, which I would also include kind of their close-in volunteer leadership that contributes a lot of energy. The middle layer is interesting because in the context of CPG, you might be dealing with distributors and wholesalers, retailers, all that, the full supply chain to get to the end consumer. In the case of associations, you typically aren't dealing with that kind of a scenario, but I still think there's lessons we can learn from some of your experiences there, because associations do distribute their value through partners in a lot of cases, sometimes through partnerships and affiliates, sometimes through things like the context of chapters and structures like that. So ultimately, I think there's some really good parallels here. So I just want to quickly draw those for our listeners so they understand kind of how your world might relate to the way that they're thinking about things.
Do you feel like any of those buckets have easier wins than others in terms of like the engagement piece, the middle layer that you mentioned, and then employee productivity? Like it would just one that you always like to start with?
I think that the employee productivity or anything internal, you just have more control over, right? Yeah. And legal departments stress less about. Like whenever you're actually directly engaging someone outside your company, you have to be very careful there. There's all sorts of ethical issues. You need to make sure that it's not saying something you wouldn't want to say, protecting the brand. And so that just gets more challenging in that you just have to put a lot of thought into how you're going to mitigate any potential bad actors or bad outcomes. Whereas you obviously don't want to give bad information to your employees, but it's a more of a contained risk than it is when it goes external. And so oftentimes we encourage my clients to start there, both because it is a little bit easier, it feels a little bit less dangerous. It also allows them to help build excitement and engagement throughout the organization. That it's one thing to hear about, hey, we're doing this cool thing that helps these consumers, and obviously I want consumers to be great, but I'm in finance, I don't really ever see them, versus like, oh, this is something I can actually see and touch, and it helps me make my job easier or do something I don't want to do. That's pretty exciting. And to Amith's point earlier on the change management aspect of here, a big part of the battle is just getting buy-in of like, this is something that is useful to me and it's worth me putting up a little pain of trying it out and recognizing that new tools have bugs and they don't always work as we thought. But getting those wins, start building that advocacy and building those champions and getting people just able to use and see how it can help them is often a big part of the initial battle.
John, how frequently do you find in these larger organizations there's resistance from employees due to fear of job loss?
quite a bit. It also depends on what the use case is. I think it's less so on specific use cases we are sort of discussing, because often we try and develop it with the teams, and more of what they're reading in the newspapers. And you see all these headlines of like 70% of white collar jobs disappearing, and and people worry about that. And this is not new. Creative destruction has been a big part of our economy for the last century, if not more. And so I think there is recognition that there will be disruption here, and that worries them. I think where I tend to land, and this is not a unique view to me, is that those who put their head in the sand are the most likely to be disrupted. I think there is going to be plenty of opportunity, at least until the robots completely take over, but plenty of opportunity for those who understand generative AI, understand how to use it as a tool to augment their own ability, are going to be well positioned to continue to succeed wherever they go. This is just, I think, a little bit like 25, 30 years ago, people who refused to use the internet, they said this is a fad, or I don't want to use email. It does replace part of your job, right? Like you'd spend less time on research, you'd spend less time on maybe writing letters, whatever the case is, but it ultimately allows you to do a lot more things, and it augments your ability to be far more productive. And so that's the message we try and get across of how are you going to use this technology to upskill yourself and allow you to be actually a much more productive and attractive employee wherever you go. And recognizing that some things will go away. We don't have telephone operators anymore. And that was a huge employer, 50, 100 years ago. But we also now have UX designers, and we have developers, and we have people who create generative AI. And so there are always sort of an upskilling and increasing of what people are working on. But it is important to help contextualize that and frame that and have people understand where they fit in.
One of the things we think associations have a really critical role to play is in the area of educating their professions on AI. So certainly educating their teams on how to use AI. And, it goes back to, I throw this out all the time on this pod, that I think there's going to be two types of people in the near future: the people that are natively knowledgeable, trained, up to speed on generative AI or AI in general. And there's going to be people who are unemployed. And so that's pretty much it. And so, reason I say it that directly is we're trying to get people to learn this stuff, right? Just to, first of all, get awareness of what it can do, and then learn a little bit of it. But, I think a little bit about the context of uptake of how people, do this within, the industries you work in. And so every industry has associations, sometimes multiple associations. Sometimes there's associations for little slices of the industry or different sides of a supply chain, for example. But I believe that they all have an opportunity and a responsibility in a way to train their professions on AI to better disseminate this information. What I'm curious about is, within your practice and the clients you work with, what's the uptake in terms of learning? Like, if you take a broader population of employees, how many of them have actually been offered AI training? How many of them have taken that up? If you could, I don't know if you have rough ideas of any quantitative metrics on that.
Yeah, I guess I'll share directional metrics with this. So a lot of my clients, that has been a big push over the last years. Like, how do we upskill and train our people on this tool? One, to use the tools we're giving them, but as importantly, for them to come up with their own ideas and their own use cases that sort of more the sort of raw, whether it's ChatGPT or Claude or any of these tools, use the tool itself in addition to anything we're creating for them. And so helping to figuring out how to design those training courses is important. Ideally, involving generative AI in those training courses to sort of act as a teacher can sort of give you sort of two birds with one stone. And so that's something that we encourage our clients to do, is sort of think through how you can use this as part of the training, not just have it just be a PowerPoint slide. And so I think in terms of uptake, it sort of varies. That it is, at least my current client, it was offered to everyone. So I think tens of thousands of employees across the world. I think almost everyone has taken the training. It was partly because it was a mandatory training. I still think time will tell in terms of use. That there are still a lot of people who I think understand it, but don't think it's for them. They're like, well, I'm an accountant, I don't need this tool. Or that's for the marketing people to come up with cool slogans and pictures. Or I'm an ops, that's not for me. And one area that we are still trying to crack is helping people understand that really, no matter what your job is, this is a useful tool. And one of the sort of analogies I use is, think what you would do if you had, as the cost of labor approaches zero, what would you do differently? If you could have a reasonably bright, or as some of the research has shown, might even PhD bright, analyst there who could help you develop your answer for free within a few minutes, how do you do things differently? And thinking about that is challenging for a lot of people because they were trained on Google, right? And so if I have a question, I write in 5 or 6 keywords, I see what I get. If it's not on the first page, I try 5 or 6 different keywords. That's not a page I might give up and say it's not there. Versus generative AI, it's a completely different interaction model, right? I'm actually gonna give you quite a bit of detail, like I would a person I'm assigning this to, of like, hey, here's what we're trying to do, here's what we're trying to achieve, here's an example of how I've done in the past, whatever that is. And then if you get something back that maybe you don't think is exactly right, telling it why, saying, hey, this isn't it. Here's why it should be different, or I want it to look more like this, or stop that, or whatever the case is. So treating it as a person rather than a machine, and how you give feedback to a person rather than a machine, is a huge unlock that is just a different approach than most people will take. And so that takes time. That it's one thing to see it in a training module. It's one thing even to see a demo. It's another thing to actually do it. And I think part of the struggle often is, now that we are more hybrid, it's harder to see the person next to you do it, right? And I think that also, that assimilation is just slower than it was when there's more co-location. We're getting there, but especially for the larger organizations who, again, are busy and have day jobs, it is a slower uptake than maybe we would like.
John, I've got 2 quick things coming out of that, and then I know Mallory has a list of things she's excited to ask you, so I'll pass the baton back to her. But the 2 quick things: one is the mandatory versus voluntary on the training piece. We talk about that from time to time here. Associations tend to be very consensus-driven and opt-in kind of mindset, as opposed to, thou shalt do this kind of mindset.
Yeah.
In the organizations you've been involved with, for the ones that have had mandatory training versus the ones that may not have chosen to do that, what's the difference in uptake in the AI training amongst their team?
They take it versus they don't, right? Like, for most of my clients, if they're busy, right? And so if you give them an optional training, the people who be most likely to take that are people who are interested in the topic and have probably already learned about it ahead of the training, right?
Yep.
And so the person you need to get to are those who don't think it's relevant to them or find it somewhat intimidating. Those are the people you need to get to. That the people who are willing to take it are actually probably already fine.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to have you say all that because our listeners need to understand that the same thing applies in corporations, and this is true in government as well, that there are times when you have to mandate things, and this is one of those times. It is actually the responsibility of the leader to ensure that their people have a path to growth, and absent training in AI, it's clearly, obviously, our opinion here that you don't have a very rosy future. So I think it's where that's kind of the moral imperative of the leader to drive that. Of course, it's important for the business as well. So the second thing I wanted to ask you before I hand it back to Mallory is this, and you said something that I think is actually quite profound, that people have to rethink what the possibilities are in a way. This isn't exactly what you said, but to ask a better question, or maybe to ask many more questions. Whereas, we've been trained to essentially formulate a hypothesis and then try to test it. And that might be true in drug discovery. It might be true in a business paradigm. It might be true in testing a marketing campaign. But we generally are doing kind of a serial process of coming up with a hypothesis, testing it. Generally speaking, we fall in love with it while we're testing it. So we bias ourselves into saying, yes, it's good, because we don't want to be a failure. That, of course, is endemic to all of us. And then we move forward or we don't. But and now I think we have the opportunity potentially to ask 10, 50, 100, 1,000 questions in parallel. What are your thoughts on that?
Totally agree. And I think you can still even have a hypothesis. You can just validate it much faster. Or like it's even this thinking through how you frame the question. So I want you to be a really staunch critic of all new ideas, and I'm going to propose an idea to you, and I want to hear your feedback. And so that can help me prepare for the eventual feedback I get, and I can sort of iterate on that. Or even I have this idea and I don't know how to think about it. Can you help me provide structure to it? Or can you help me write a better prompt to get you to give me more structure to this? Like, you can get some meta with it. Or even a example that I've seen, which is somewhat tangential, what you said, is especially now it has voice mode and everything like that. If I have colleagues who just on their drive home just brain dump and just talk to it. and there's not a little structure to like, oh, I had this meeting and this is what happened. Oh, and I also had this idea, is completely stream of consciousness. But then they sort of have this 20-minute sort of dump of information at the end of every day. And then it says, hey, organize that thinking and provide structure to it. And that way I can search it and I can come back to it. But it's a way for them to sort of use the tool to help them digest information and keep themselves smarter. That is another way. It's not exactly what you're getting at, but the idea of using the tool to ask questions and ask it to do things that isn't like a better version of today. It's a completely new thing that you don't do today is important. And so part of the guidance I give my teams, and those, especially those that work for me, is every time I ask you to do something, or anyone asks you to do something, your first 30 seconds should be like, okay, how can I get Gen AI to do this for me, or at least give me a starting point? The value of going from a blank page to a 60% answer is enormous. And so this isn't to say you should write it in and just send whatever it comes out to you directly, not look at it, but it is a way, how do you get the 50, 60, 70% answer and either iterate with the tool or just take the pen and go from there. But one, start with that. And two, if you don't know how to use the tool, ask it. And this is, I think, can be an unlock, especially for new people, like, hey, I don't know how to write a prompt. I'm trying to do this thing. Can you help me write a prompt to help you understand what I want? It's kind of meta. It feels a little bit like three-dimensional chess, but it actually can be a really useful tool that even I use sometimes. There have been times where I'm like, I'm just not getting what I want. And I'll respond like, hey, look, you're not giving me what I want. Can you help me phrase this so you better understand what I'm trying to get at? I'm trying to accomplish these things. And then it gives me a prompt that I can give feedback to it. And it sort of feels like a cheat code, but it can be really effective. And sort of that trial and error and how do I rethink how to use this tool is, more than half the battle. Just start using it and testing and experimenting, and you'll find where you're comfortable and where you have more versus less success along the way.
Building on that for just a second, one of the cheat codes related to that meta prompting approach that I've used quite effectively is I go to something like a ChatGPT or a Claude and I say, hey, listen, I need to go work with another AI that's not quite as sophisticated as you are. And so I'd really love your help in creating a prompt that a lesser AI would be able to understand and complete the following task. And it's like, kind of like, it's just like all of us, oh, yeah, I'm a superior AI. So the AI responds really well to flattery. I just got to say that. So.
It is funny how it does that even things like, hey, this is important to me in my career. Please take your time, take a breath and think through it before you go. Mm-hmm. It feels weird to write that to a potentially a probabilistic engine, but it actually can be quite effective. So yeah, I still say please and thank you when I write prompts, that it just feels natural. Again, also helps me get in the mindset of the same way I'd ask a person, I'm asking this machine the same way, because that is a closer paradigm than maybe we've had historically.
Well, and you and I are both also hedging for the likely future that we're heading into, where we're not in charge of this planet. So we'll see what happens.
Proceed. Use it out. Nice.
Hey, now, we're not alarmist on the Sidecar Sync podcast. Well, I think we're all in agreement here that training is kind of one of those essential first steps. Education, that's really the whole reason why Sidecar exists. But we do have a lot of association leaders that I've had conversations with that think, okay, we're rolling out this AI training, but we're struggling with what we do next. We've made this investment. How do we justify this investment to our board? But also when talking about employee productivity, how do we measure, right? Everything that we've trained on. So when you're working with clients who particularly want to improve employee productivity, what do you see as that next phase after education or training?
It's a problem a lot of companies are dealing with right now of, this is cool, but like now what? Show me why this makes sense other than cool chatbots. And I think there are sort of two ways I think about it. One, this gets back to the point I made toward the beginning of, it's important to have sort of that bold ambition you're headed towards, because that's ultimately, I'm improving employee productivity to accomplish X. So being focused on the ends rather than the means is important, because then you can also not only show financial outcomes, but you can also show how you're progressing towards whatever the bigger, bolder thing that you're trying to accomplish is. So that's one thing. I think second is being really clear about what you're trying to measure and why. That's a lot of times say we're going to improve employee productivity, and the implicit assumption is, and if we do that, we'll save money. It's sort of like, not really, unless you're removing headcount. There's really no savings. Your employees are slightly more productive, but there's probably not a clear financial savings. There might be a indirect financial savings of like they're generating better answers, our customers are happier, so we have higher retention, and that actually, but that's a harder connection to tie. And so I think it's important to understand, like, if our goal is to achieve savings, that must mean we are going to reduce headcount, reduce tech spend, reduce something, and Gen AI will help us get there. So that's key. It's also, I think, perfectly reasonable to have more qualitative measures of we're going to have higher employee retention, we're going to have higher NPS, we're going to have higher, more visits, more traffic, whatever it is. Just be clear about that. I also find, at least with the clients I work with, that savings comes more from necessity than planning. What I mean by that is if you want to save 20%, for example, it's a lot harder to say, okay, go find me 20% using Gen AI than it is to say, I already took the 20% away, use Gen AI to make it work, right? And so that necessity there of, actually, we don't have these people anymore, so we have to find a way to use it. And here's a way we can save everyone 2 hours a day, and that will fill the gap. That I see work quite well, even though it can be somewhat stressful. It's just much harder, just a human nature, to be like, yeah, we could do this and it could save us time, but I don't know, I'm not sure. And that's just harder. There needs to be some forcing function there, I think, to really see at least cost savings. Again, this is separate from growth saving or growth generation or other sort of metrics, but on the cost side, that's what I see with my clients.
Building on Mallory's question of where to get started, a lot of people I talk to say, hey, we really want to try to find a way to make take some of the load off of our customer service or member service team, which tends to be overwhelmed, and also improve the quality of customer service at the same time. And there's actually this concern that comes up saying, hey, I've got X number of people that, answer emails and phone calls all day, and what happens to them if we automate it? And I do think that absent the desire and reason to cut headcount, you're not going to have a financial savings from it, but you potentially can create far more value. Mm-hmm. Part of it is the people who do that work oftentimes are far underutilized, not necessarily in terms of their times, but in terms of their knowledge. And so they're answering the same question over and over and over, the same case over and over and over. They are probably trained on lots of other things that are perhaps more interesting to them intellectually, but also potentially higher value. And so by using AI to automate some of the lower level tasks, and for example, the customer service workflow, you do some interesting things there in terms of employee morale and retention, lower training cycles. The other thing too is I think that particular use case might be worth digging into a little bit with you, because I look at it as kind of a dual benefit type of scenario in that it can make the internal ops more efficient. But if you automate customer service really well, in this way, the way we're doing it now, it actually can increase the quality of customer service, which is pretty remarkable, because if you think about the entire history of customer service tech up until recently, it's only been on the one side. It's about cost savings. Like nobody thinks phone trees and the kind of bots that were on screens before were enjoyable, right? It's like everyone, like you get on the phone with your airline, you go agent, agent, agent immediately, right? Because you want to get past the technology. But that's not the case anymore. You know, like one of the case studies we talk about a lot on this pod, it's a little bit old now. It's about 12 months old, which in AI timelines is ancient, but it's this Klarna case study that you probably have heard of, John, where they put an AI agent in their workflow, and the most notable outcome from that was they went from an 11-minute resolution time to a 2-minute resolution time. I don't know too many people who'd prefer to be on a customer service request for 11 minutes instead of 2, right? And so when something becomes better, cheaper, and more available, generally people consume more of it. So perhaps this could actually lead to an increase in customer service requests, which most organizations would view that as a net negative, right? The metrics typically are not positive. You're not rated well if you have more customer service inquiries. People think your product sucks or there's some problem with it. But what if we flipped that script and said, hey, our customer service is so great, and oh, by the way, we can scale it to infinity. People want to talk to us all the time. Wouldn't that be awesome?
Yeah. And educate how we can use a tool differently or upsell opportunities. Yeah. And I totally agree with you. I mean, customer service, I think, is not a pleasant experience for either party right now. That it's no fun to be on hold for 10 minutes. It's no fun to be yelled at by every customer annoyed they've been on hold for 10 minutes. And so one thing that I saw with one of my clients, which I thought was interesting, was we had they started using AI for customer service and contact centers, first to just inform the agent and giving them sort of a knowledge base to search and help answer questions. and in some cases starting to answer some of the calls. But in their pilot, what they found is actually the average call time, to your point, went down, but the call time with the human operators actually went up. And like, what's going on here? This is a disaster. Our people are somehow getting worse. But when they actually looked in and started listening to the calls, they're actually having much richer, deeper connections with the people who called in, because the easy stuff was going to the bots, right? I need to change my address, my order's lost, whatever it is. Instead, it was like, hey, I'm having this problem. Can you help me figure it out? And it was much more of a, yes, let me figure it out. Let's work together. Let's brainstorm. And you build a much deeper connection there, to your point, which is great for the customer who had a good experience and be like, hey, someone that spent 20 minutes helping me solve a problem. It's also a much better experience for the operator who's talking to them, because they feel a lot more purpose. They're helping someone. They have much more enjoyable experience than, let me go track your order, or whatever the case may be. And so I think you're right that you may need fewer people, because depending on the proportion of calls that are sort of easy versus more challenging. But for the people who are staying, I think it's a much richer and better experience for both sides of the conversation.
So if I was an association CEO, based on that, what I would consider doing is putting in an AI, an agent, to handle a lot of the routine customer service, member service inquiries. But then I'd have my team, whether it's 5 people or 50 people that do member service, I'd have them actually proactively reach out to members and try to offer value, right? And try to find ways to be proactively able to serve. And I think there's lots of creative ways people could do that. Just have conversations, just say, hey, I'm checking in, wanted to talk to you about your experience with this and provide value, not just like a survey. People don't like those phone calls, but something that's truly value additive. And of course, if you use some AI to drive personalization and have a better idea of what John or Mallory or Amith might be interested in, that can be helpful too. But those are things you can't even begin to think of right now, because we're so overwhelmed by the workload we have. And this is the kind of creative outlet, I think, that you refer to as creative destruction. We destroy the traditional workflow and reduce that purely to automation, but leave room for this incredibly creative outlet.
Yeah. And there's a middle ground also of what they were trying to solve is the person, whoever was calling, would describe their problem. And it wasn't like pick one of 7 options and I'm going to ask you to repeat yourself. Use whatever words you want as much time as you want. And the AI would try to synthesize that. And it could then use logic of like, this is easy or this is trickier. And the trickier ones is the ones they bring the people in. And even when they brought the people were not there on their own. They also had the AI using Whisper and any of the other tools listening in. And so on their screen, it could both track it. It could say, here's a answer to their question, or here is, depending on how commercial you want, here's an opportunity to upsell or encourage a new event or product that maybe they weren't considering earlier. And it could also give coaching of, they seem frustrated. Here's something to say to help calm them down. Like, you can think through ways of arming your people to have better tools, to have better conversations, in addition to automating a great degree of it.
I want to unpack that for just a minute, because not all of our listeners are familiar with Whisper, but Whisper is actually an open source model from OpenAI. It's one of the few open source things that they published that's inferenced on a whole variety of clouds, including Grok and AWS and Azure, and provides essentially real-time, audio to text translation, which can then be fed into any kind of other model. So what John's describing is, this workflow where in real time, the AI is not only listening and transcribing what the speaker on the other end is saying, but potentially being able to suggest, answers and ways to improve the call. And that's, I think, a tremendous use case for that technology. It's a great example of a co-pilot scenario versus an autopilot scenario.
Yeah. And then use it on sort of the back end to provide feedback to your team and help them get better of like, hey, here are some things where maybe the call didn't go so well. Here are some things you can try in the future. So you sort of have this continuous improvement element as well to give you better visibility into who's doing well and why. Or maybe an agent does something, not an agent, a human agent does something that you wouldn't have expected that actually worked really well. And how do you then incorporate that into your operating procedure? So yeah, there's things you can do to avoid the call, the things you can do to improve the call, and the things you can do after the call using the technology to all make it a better experience for all sides.
In that example, did the consumer think they were talking to a human, or were they aware more or less, you think, that they were talking to an agent?
It's a good question, Mallory. I suspect, and this was maybe 8-9 months ago, so I suspect they probably knew they were talking to a bot at the time. Mm-hmm. The tech's gotten better, so you could probably hide it. In this particular pilot, the company actually wanted to make sure it was clear, so they told you. at the beginning that you were talking to a bot. They weren't trying to trick you. And it also made it clear when you were talking to a human. And so a lot of what they're trying to do is figure out how do we sort of triage these calls appropriately and sit it down the right path. But you could go down a path where you are trying to make it hard to tell the difference. You have to make a call on how comfortable you are with that and how comfortable your customers would be with that. But it is, the tech's getting good enough now that it can be hard to distinguish.
I was thinking of my own personal examples where I don't even do phone trees anymore. I just say customer service rep over and over and over again.
Smash zero, see what happens.
Yeah, no, I'm not even playing that game anymore. So I'm going to have to kind of reevaluate that when things change. But I think that's a neat use case that you shared. I'm curious if you have any other Gen AI use cases that you are particularly proud of or that you always go back to in terms of how successful they were.
There are lots that come to mind. It's also, I think, unlike some other tech, it's just far more expansive. That it's a use case is really whatever you can think of that might work or might prop during the day. One that's fairly simple, but I think quite powerful, is just better knowledge management within your association, within whatever organization you're in. That especially, I would imagine, for a lot of nonprofits and organizations, especially if there's volunteer labor, there's a lot of sort of tribal knowledge of, well, Mallory just knows this because Mallory's been here for 20 years and she's always known this. And that can make transitions quite challenging. And one thing I did with one of my clients is they did tons of consumer research of, hey, in this country, for this product, for this situation, for this demographic, whatever it was. And they spent lots of money on this. And unless you were directly involved in that project, you probably had no idea it happened. And they were spending, millions and millions of dollars on this. And so the idea of being able hey, what if we take all this, 100-slide PowerPoint decks and PDFs and throw it into this tool, and then anyone can just query it. I'm launching this new product in this country and I'm targeting this demographic. What should I be aware of? And it can then pull from all that and provide the sources if you want to go deeper, but can just give you a quick answer. And that applies to really any organization. Every organization has a ton of knowledge. Remarkably little of it is codified. And even if it is codified, if it's on slide 74 of an onboarding deck, no one's going to see it. And if they do see it, they're going to forget it 10 minutes later. And so this idea of having sort of the knowledge of the company accessible. We sort of have this now on the internet. We take it for granted. Essentially knowledge of humanity is accessible. You could do that for your company as well, your organization. And so I think that's a really good, relatively easy use case to start with to get you comfortable. And everyone can start using it, understanding it. You can think very small of maybe we just put our HR policies on there. So if someone's hey, do we have dental coverage or what's our vacation policy? I can answer questions like that. To much more expansive of for my clients, hey, I want to write a new brief for a new campaign. Bakes it on all our research we have and give me a draft campaign that I can edit and then share with an agency. So you can think of it, there's a wide spectrum of applications, but that's one that I think is sort of a easy one that's a good one to get started on.
I think what's interesting there too, we talk about this a lot, is the idea of knowledge management internally, but then for associations as well, the idea of knowledge management for their members, because they're huge repositories of some of the most authoritative content in their profession or respective spaces. So being able to synthesize that with an AI and then have their members interact with that AI to get that information, and that exists. We talk about it a lot. It's called BettyBot, but I think that's an interesting use case for sure for associations.
Yeah.
Another related element to this is kind of the untapped knowledge from unstructured data, which John's referring to as well as part of what he just described. And I think it's just an opportunity to zoom in and say, well, when you think about knowledge management, part of that is understanding who knows what, as he pointed out. And that is by itself part of the tribal knowledge. It's it's not just the fact that Mallory knows X and has known that for 20 years, but the fact that I know that Mallory knows X is also tribal knowledge. Yet that information actually does exist in digital form. It's probably reflected somewhere in your emails. It's probably reflected somewhere in your SharePoint documents. It's probably reflected in your Teams or Slack conversations by virtue of the back and forth and the types of things people have said. And you own all that information. And so, an AI that would be able to continuously scour all these unstructured sources with the purpose essentially being able to index and catalog, what people are knowledgeable about and being able to connect people based on what they're working on. Another related thing is like, John and Mallory both work at large company X, and they're both working on basically the same project, but have no idea that they're both working on the same project. This happens all the time. It, in fact, even happens at associations with 100 employees or less. How do you detect that? How do you know that? How do you connect these people so they can collaborate? Not only reduce potential for redundancy, but also just make it better, right? And these are things that I am confident, like every workforce tool, workflow tool will have this. This will be built into Microsoft 365. It'll be built into Google. It might take a few years, but there's also opportunities for a lot of third-party apps. For now, we actually have something very similar to what I just described on the drawing board as a product that we're thinking about building. But I think that this is crazy, right? Because the idea that historically you would try to maintain that kind of thing, you'd have like a database of all the skills of all of your employees and try to track all the projects. And yeah, you can kind of sort of do that, but it gets out of date by the minute, the moment you put it together. It's so hard to get that up to date. So I think this is such an amazing opportunity to kind of extract those structured insights from this mountain of unstructured information we have.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you all covered this in the past, but I know some area that some of my clients get nervous about, like, hey, but wait, isn't all our data going to go train the public models and it's all going to leak? And now all clients have these enterprise instances that nothing leaves their instance, their domain. And so this is all protected and safe and secure. The models will still sometimes give wrong information. And so there's still hallucinations, other issues you need to work on. It's not bulletproof, but it is not the issue where I think there was a lot of concern a year or two ago of, I don't want to give it all my information because that's going to then be public domain.
When I asked you, John, about successful use cases, you said there are so many to pull from. We talked about knowledge management. We talked about customer service. You saying there's so many to pull from makes me think you were, one, very good at your job. But I'm curious, if you were in AI and you could kind of extrapolate across all the AI implementations, rollouts that you've done with clients, do you feel like there are any patterns, any threads that you have noticed in terms of clients that are really successful and maybe clients that are less successful that you could kind of generalize and share with our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is not dissimilar from any project in that the ones that are more successful have really clear definitions of what success is. And so it's really easy, but like, this is really cool. Let's build something. And then you build it and someone's like, well, what does it do? It's like, what does this one thing? Like, do we want that one thing? I don't know. And so having an idea of like, another way is, I don't advise my clients to have a Gen AI strategy. I advise them to have a strategy and think how Gen AI can enable that they should not be separate things. And so similar here, that this is less of, let me go think of a bunch of Gen AI use cases and more of, how can I go improve my business or improve my organization? And then as part of that, I should think how Gen AI can help accelerate that or make something possible that wasn't possible before. And so that's where I see more success is we're trying to accomplish a business goal or business outcome, and Gen AI enables that rather than we're trying to build this chatbot, which is a solution in search of a problem.
I'm curious what you think about that, Amith, in terms of Gen AI fueling the strategy, because I feel like what we have often talked about on the pod is sometimes these strategies for associations can be so set in stone, and they can be to improve or replace some legacy system that might not drive that much change for them in the end. So what are your thoughts there?
Well, I mean, a lot of people come to me and say, hey, our strategic plan that we set in 2021, says X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, well, that's cool. I hope you it's quality content for your museum, maybe, but it's no longer relevant at all, because the reality of it is the strategy is informed by the possibilities of the world that you live in. And when the world radically changes and the opportunities are radically different, the competition's different, the risks are different, the strategic framework has to shift. I mean, for one thing, you have to be a lot more nimble than a 5-year strategic plan. Like, I don't look further out than 2 years. I have ideas of what might happen in 5 or 10, but I don't know anybody any better than anyone else, really. But next 2 years, I have a continuous rolling shift in terms of what we're going to go after based on the rapidly changing environment. But you cannot inform strategy effectively if the environmental factors external to your organization have changed, even a small amount, but certainly radically like this. So strategy has to be informed by those opportunities and those risks. Otherwise, your strategy is, like I said, basically a historical artifact and irrelevant.
And I think that's fair, Amith. I think I probably should preface with assuming you have a up-to-date and effective strategy.
Yeah, for sure.
My push is you should have a business outcome should be the driver.
Agreed.
Not a technology for the sake of it. And so
I knew what you were saying with that. And I think a lot of times people think, okay, well, our strategy, our business outcome circa 2021 was these three things, and we set that was our 5-year goal set. Well, sometimes you have to throw that out and reset it. But yeah, no, totally makes sense. Having clarity and outcomes, I think, is one of the most critical lessons I think the association sector needs to zoom in on and say, well, what should those outcomes be and why do they matter? And are they quantitative? Are they binary? Did we achieve them or not? Are they measurable to begin with? Are they time bound? Are they, things that actually will achieve the general business outcome if we have the measurable, outcome we think we're going to get? And a lot of times there's murkiness around that. That's true in corporations too, but in associations, I find that a lot of the so-called objectives, I don't have any way to know whether or not I've achieved them after the fact. They just say, hey, we want to have improved member service. Okay, what does that mean? So you have to really refine it the way I think you were alluding to. It's really critical.
Yeah, absolutely. And it gets back to our point earlier about, hey, how do I see ROI? How do I see impact? You have to know where you're going before, because to your point, otherwise, if there isn't a clear yes or no answer at the end, then it's very hard to know if you're successful.
Well, Mallory, earlier you just asked John to kind of articulate if he was an AI, which is kind of a fun, creative exercise for all of us. And for me, I've actually been accused more than once about that I have been an AI. So I think that's kind of funny. My kids sometimes call me a bot, which I thought was a compliment at first. So
I don't think so.
What does that mean? I looked it up on, I think it was Urban Dictionary. I'm like, oh wait, that's not positive. But I thought it was high praise, So.
Amith wants to be a bot. It could be high praise. I think you could take it that way.
Oh, I think that's how it was meant.
Well, I know we're almost out of time. At the top of the pod, John, you were talking about the idea of imagining what's possible, which I think is a really creative way to think about Gen AI in particular. And kind of if you had this PhD level assistant at all times, what would you do? And what would you do with your time as a human? So I'm curious, if you were doing that same exercise right now, is there anything near term in terms of use cases that's not quite possible yet, but that you're really excited for in the next year or so to work on with your clients?
The big buzzword in Gen AI now is agentic, or having these sort of agents where you give goals to rather than tasks. And I think that's a pretty exciting concept. And so OpenAI demoed a tool called Operator recently, which essentially just uses your keyboard and mouse to just go through things. And so say, hey, go buy me tickets, go book me dinner. And it just Googles and it goes through like you would if you're a person. And so you can think, does that mean we're going to reduce APIs? How's that? There's lots of implications there. But where I find the agents exciting, or the opportunity exciting, is how it can own sort of an end-to-end process. So I'm going to use a procurement example because I think that's most tangible. And maybe you can help me translate this specifically to associations. But imagine you are at a company like, hey, I need a service. We don't do that internally. I need to go get a partner to help me with this. And so I need to write an RFP. And that's kind of a chore. So instead, let's say I had this sort of vendor management agent, and I can say, hey, here's my situation. I need a vendor that can do X, Y, and Z. Help me write the RFP. And it's going to ask you clarifying questions. You can answer it, and you'll sort of write it together. And you're like, okay, cool. Now I have an RFP. Maybe I trained on 1,000 RFP examples we have in the past, whatever the case is. And then I can send that out. Now I get responses for this RFP, and they're like, great. Now I have a bunch of 50-slide PowerPoint decks I have to review. Instead, I'm going to throw all those into the same agent, which built the RFP with me, and say, hey, help me grade these. And while you're grading it, also look to see if we've worked with any of these companies before, and if we had a good experience or a bad experience, to help me understand how I should think about which of these vendors is the best bet. So then it helps you actually select the vendor and do it in a better job than most humans would, or at least enhance most humans would, because it's actually going to get into the details. Where I think it really gets exciting is then you can have it maintained going forward. And so every time I get an invoice, hey, make sure that this invoice looks right based on our agreement. Am I getting all my right discounts? Am I getting the right rebates? Is it time to renegotiate because things have changed? And you almost have this tool, this agent that exists indefinitely. And you can do this as one sort of vendor. You can do this with 100 vendors. And it allows you to sort of own this process end to end, and then restart the process, renegotiate, whatever. that I think can be pretty exciting. That's a procurement example, but you can think of them in finance. You can think of them in terms of member retention. You can think in terms of employee onboarding. There are lots of really cool examples of if the tool could understand a goal rather than a task, that it unlocks a lot more opportunity.
John, that's an excellent example. And first of all, for all of our association friends, as well as the vendor community that are listening, the term RFP is definitely a well-known term. Associations do issue quite a few of them, not at the scale of a corporation that's running a procurement process where they're repetitively buying certain kinds of products or services, or at that scale where that level of automation may be justifiable. They may be doing 10 RFPs a year or 50 RFPs a year for a large organization. But it would still be valuable to do that because you could still use some of the steps, maybe just not in a full auto way where, as you described, where the agent's actually emailing vendors and all that kind of stuff. But maybe the idea would be that it helps you write the RFP, it helps you evaluate the responses and helps you catch things that you may not have otherwise have done. Take in 5 or 10 responses and to normalize them into a spreadsheet to help it make a comparison easier and all those types of things. So I think what you said is, first of all, pretty darn relevant for this community. So that's appreciated. I would translate it also to another business process that's totally different, but at the same time similar, which is the process associations go through to produce content. And for many organizations, that involves this idea that's RFP-like. It's called a call for speakers or a call for papers, where an association will say to their community, hey, we're going to have this event coming up in June, and we're opening up a call for speakers, and we'd like people to submit proposals. And there's typically some kind of rubric that says, hey, to submit, you have to provide this amount of content. It has to be on one of these subjects. You have to have this kind of experience. Maybe you need a co-presenter or not. Maybe you have to be a published author if it's an academic institution, that oftentimes is the case. On and on and on, right? And there's this whole process where they're intaking all these proposals that are coming in to speak, and they have to grade them, then they have to provide feedback, and they have to kind of filter it down to a narrower set. Very, very similar in a lot of respects. That process is a perfect candidate for an agent that would do a great job both streamlining the efficiency, the way you described, ultimately producing better content, because one of the problems that associations have in the workflow I'm describing is they have a lot of kind of biases, just like we all do. Like the people who are in the committee that's typically making these selection decisions, they've looked at a lot of these same names in the past, and they're like, oh, I know this person, they're pretty good. Yep. I know John, maybe I don't want to include him. So like you have those kinds of scenarios going on. And the AI, I think, is going to be a little bit more thorough, perhaps a little bit more objective than a lot of us would be. And then ultimately perhaps produce more novel content and produce more interesting content in areas the association sometimes has a hard time doing. And also the other thing is one of the main ways that you get rid of newer presenters or speakers who are submitting to you is you ghost them. And what a lot of associations do is they'll take months to respond to people, say, it's kind of like, you're getting a ruling from the king, like saying, oh, we hereby, deem you worthy to come and speak at our event. It's like you get a scroll in the mail. That's how it feels. It's that slow. Whereas, it would be great if, first of all, if I screwed up, if I submitted something incomplete, I get an immediate response saying, hey, you're not too bright, are you? You should really probably include your resume or whatever. Something, maybe that's not the best email template, but something like that where I'm like, oh, damn, I forgot to include that. Let me upload that and have a shot at being considered. People would like that, as well as faster feedback at all of the stages, including maybe some qualitative feedback saying, hey, your proposal was too similar to many others we got. And, in the future, maybe here's some other topics you might consider. That would improve, like in all angles, like the customer service example, everyone's experience. So it's kind of translating a kind of a similar workflow to what you're describing into something I think a lot of our folks would really find a lot of value in to both improve their product and decrease their pain.
Yeah. And even feedback in real time. So not just you weren't selected and here's why, but this isn't there yet, but we really like this idea. Could you blow that up and do more there and resubmit? Totally. And a lot of speakers are like, yeah, totally. I'd love to present on that. It sounds super interesting.
Exactly.
So it doesn't just have to be after the fact. It can be real-time improvement as well.
John, thank you so much for joining us today on the Sidecar Sync podcast. I think you've shared tons of insights and stories that will be incredibly beneficial for our association listeners. So thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you both. It was a fun conversation.
Thanks for tuning in to Sidecar Sync this week. Looking to dive deeper? Download your free copy of our new book, Ascend, Unlocking the Power of AI for Associations at ascendbook.org. It's packed with insights to power your association's journey with AI. And remember, Sidecar is here with more resources from webinars to boot camps to help you stay ahead in the association world. We'll catch you in the next episode. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep disrupting.